Hello, welcome all of you. My name is Samapti Sinha Mahapatra and I'm your zoology teacher teaching in Sri Chaitanya Institute. Students, we were already discussing about the chapter Chemical Coordination and Integration, and today we are at the end of this chapter. In the previous class, if you remember, we were discussing about the hormones produced by some other organs. We have already discussed all the endocrine glands, but we were still discussing about the hormones like produced from the kidneys that we discussed. And today we are going to discuss the remaining part of that portion, and today we are going to start with the hormones of GIT or the hormones of gastrointestinal tract. So I have made a table where I have written the name of the hormone, the source of the hormone, where does it act, the target and the function. So it is going to become quite easy for all of you to understand this way. Now starting with the first hormone, that is gastrin. Student, the name itself is suggesting its source. The source, gastro, is stomach. Also very easy to remember, the target is stomach. Now you know very well that stomach you have gastric juice. So what happens when this gastrin acts upon the stomach? It is going to stimulate certain cells called as G cells, gastric cells. It is going to stimulate the gastric cells, which is the exocrine part, to release the gastric juice. So source of gastrin, stomach, target stomach, and function to release the gastric juice. Alright, talking about the other hormone, enterogasteron. Can you easily understand the term enterocytes? You have read somewhere that it is related with your small intestine, and gastron again means stomach. So the source is duodenum of small intestine, the target is stomach, and students, you can know the function if you know the other name of enterogasteron, which is GIP, that's gastroinhibitory peptide. So gastroinhibitory peptide means it is going to act upon the stomach and it is going to inhibit the release of gastric juice. Getting my point? Source is small intestine, duodenum, target is stomach, going to act upon stomach, cause the inhibition of release of gastric juice. Alright, moving on to the first hormone that was discovered is secretin. First hormone discovered, secretin. Source is again small intestine, duodenum, and it has got three targets: pancreas, liver and stomach. Now students, on stomach, I have written it over here, it acts like GIP. It is exactly going to perform the action like enterogasteron, which means the inhibition of release of gastric juice. But the other two functions of secretin is stimulating type. Now looking at the pancreas and looking at the liver, in the pancreas, when it acts upon the pancreas, it is going to stimulate the release of bicarbonate. Students, remember, it is going to act upon pancreas, it is going to promote the release of bicarbonate in the pancreatic juice. Whereas, when the liver is going to, the secretin is going to act upon the liver, liver has hepatocytes. And when it acts upon the hepatocyte, it is going to promote the release of the synthesis of bile juice. So on pancreas, release the bicarbonate, on liver promotes the synthesis of bile, on stomach, inhibition of gastric juice. That's about secretin. Now the fourth hormone name is CCKPZ. Read the name carefully. Cholecystokinin pancreozymin. Cholecystokinin pancreozymin. When you look at the source, is again duodenum of the small intestine, and target is to gallbladder and pancreas. Gallbladder and pancreas. Now the secretin also has a target, pancreas, but when it acts upon pancreas, what it is releasing in the bile juice is bicarbonate. When this acts upon pancreas, can you see the name? pancreozymin. So from here only you can get the target is pancreas, because pancreozymin, and zymin means enzymes. So it is going to act upon the pancreas. It is going to promote the release of enzymes in the pancreatic juice. Also, can you look at the name here? Chole is related with bile. Cysto means cystic duct. Chole means bile, and cysto is coming from the cystic duct that's present in the gallbladder. So you can know the target, and when it acts upon gallbladder, you know that gallbladder stores your bile juice. When it acts upon gallbladder, it's going to contract the gallbladder, it's going to release your bile juice. Alright, now there is a note that I have given to all of you, that you know your defense cells of your body can also communicate with each other, and they communicate by a polypeptide hormones called as cytokines. The cytokines can be of different types. I have given you one example like interferons. Students, you will learn about the interferons in the higher chapters as we move on. Interferons are produced by the virally infected cells. I'm not going to give you too much detailed information here only, because you will study this later on. Just remember that cytokines, example like interferons, are produced by the defense cells of your body. Now we are going to move to the last portion, which is mechanism of hormone action. Alright students, now let's start with the mechanism of hormone action. Recall the very first class where we have discussed about the nature of the hormone, water-soluble hormones and the lipid-soluble hormones, and that portion is very important to understand the mechanism of hormone action, although I have discussed some part in brief here also. Now students, we know that whatever the hormone is, it is always going to require certain receptors. It is going to bind with certain receptors, and then only a specific action could be produced. We are going to talk about the two types of receptors that we have. Alright, so we have got one receptor which is extracellular receptors, also called as membrane bound receptors. Extracellular receptors means present, some portion is present outside the plasma membrane or related with the membrane, hence called as membrane bound receptors. The other types of receptors are nuclear receptors. As the name is suggesting, nuclear receptors are present inside the nucleus. Alright, now talking about the extracellular receptors, we've discussed this point that it is located on the plasma membrane. This is located inside the nucleus. But how to know which hormone acts via this and which hormone acts via this? Now students, water-soluble hormones definitely being insoluble in lipid, water-soluble hormones being insoluble in lipid cannot cross the plasma membrane. Then how are they going to perform action? They have the receptors called as the membrane bound receptors. And the water-soluble hormones, if you recall, the peptide hormones, the amino acid derivative hormones, the proteinaceous hormones, they were the hormones called water-soluble. I have written over here the same thing, that proteinaceous, peptide, amino acid derivative is going to act via this kind of receptor, whereas the lipid-soluble hormones, which can cross the plasma membrane easily, will act via nuclear receptors. I have written the examples, steroids and iodinated. Now I have just written the amino acid derivative, proteinaceous, steroids and this and that. How are you going to know which hormone is steroid, which hormone is proteinaceous? So there is a trick to remember. I remember it this way. You can also follow the same method to remember. Alright. Now students, talking about this portion. If you remember this part, you can easily remember this part. Okay. So I will just mention the names of the steroids and iodinated, remaining all will belong to this category. Okay, I am not specifically mentioning the names, but all the other besides this will belong to this category and will act via this receptor. So talking about the steroids, the hormones of gonads, hormones of testes, hormone of pancreas, hormone of testes, hormone of ovaries, they belong to the category of steroids. Also the hormones of adrenal cortex, remember corticoids, they belong to steroids. Also the iodinated hormone T3 and T4 also belong to the category of the hormones which is going to act via nuclear receptors. So very easy that all the pituitary hormones, all the hypothalamic hormones, hormone of pineal, hormone of pancreas will be belonging to the category of extracellular receptors. Is it clear for all of you to very well understand which hormone going to act via which receptors? Just remember this part, you will remember this part. Now going to start with some of the basic information. I've written over here that the water-soluble hormones cannot cross the plasma membrane, hence require secondary messenger. Since your water-soluble hormones are unable to cross the plasma membrane, so they require a secondary messenger. Before knowing the secondary messenger, what is a primary messenger though? I've written it over here. The hormone acts as a primary messenger. Hormone that brings the information is going to act as the primary messenger that brings the information. But since it cannot cross the plasma membrane, it requires something which is going to do all the information inside the cell. So all the water-soluble hormones will require a secondary messenger which causes intracellular changes. The changes inside a cell. And there are a lot of examples we are going to discuss in detail that also, like cyclic AMP. This CAMP stands for cyclic adenosine monophosphate. Cyclic adenosine monophosphate, cyclic AMP. This is cyclic GMP, that is cyclic guanosine monophosphate. Also calcium. So these are the secondary messengers which are going to carry the changes inside a cell, and secondary messenger only in case of the water soluble hormones. As the lipid soluble hormones, hormone itself is acting as a messenger. It can itself cross the plasma membrane and perform the specific action. Now we are going to discuss the different mechanism through the membrane bound and through the nuclear receptors. Talking about the very first mechanism of action, which is mechanism of action via nuclear receptors, just by looking at this diagram, you will understand everything, okay? Just follow whatever I am saying, okay? Follow with the diagram. You will understand how the mechanism of action is taking place via nuclear receptors. Now let us take for an example, okay, I have made this part, okay, some part of the cell I have shown, okay. So this is the lipid membrane, plasma membrane, and this white one is the nuclear membrane. This is the plasma membrane, this is the nuclear membrane, alright. Now talking about this mechanism of action, inside the nucleus I've told you that you will have one receptor called as nuclear receptor, alright, that is present inside the nucleus. Now what is happening? The hormone estrogen, that's a female hormone. I told you that a female hormone, which is the hormone of gonad, is a lipid soluble hormone. So that is going to cross the plasma membrane, that's going to cross the nuclear membrane. Is it directly binding on the DNA? Just tell me. Do you see direct binding on the DNA? No. The very first thing that is going to happen, as soon as your hormone enters inside the cell, as soon as your hormone enters inside the nucleus, it is going to combine with the specific receptors. The hormone, students, is going to bind only with its receptors because receptors are highly specific. So once this hormone combines with the receptor, what is formed? The hormone receptor complex. Do you get my point? This is how the questions are framed. Hormone directly binding with the DNA? No. Hormone, after going inside the nucleus, combines with the nuclear receptors, forms the hormone receptor complex. Now see, this hormone receptor complex inside the nucleus is gonna bind on the specific target sites over the DNA. From the DNA, it is going to cause transcription. You know that DNA forming RNA is known as transcription. So as soon as the hormone receptor complex binds on the DNA, it's gonna cause the formation of RNA, which is ultimately then forming a specific protein via translation. Understanding? Hormone receptor complex binding on the DNA, causing transcription, forming protein, forming RNA that causes translation, forming a protein that is actually going to cause a specific physiological response, like for example tissue growth. That protein causes a specific response. That is the flow chart. Okay, I'm again telling you in short, just go through this. The hormone which is going to cross the plasma membrane, which is lipid soluble, for example estrogen, acts via nuclear receptor. It crosses the plasma membrane, it crosses the nuclear membrane, it binds with the nuclear receptor, it forms the hormone receptor complex, it binds on the DNA, that forms RNA via transcription, that forms protein via translation, and that protein is actually a specific physiological response. Got? That is the mechanism of action via nuclear receptors. Now talking about the mechanism of action via extracellular receptors. Students, this is in short. We are going to discuss by taking one example in detail about the mechanism of action of the membrane bound receptors. But in short, if you want to see how this is taking place, so this is the plasma membrane, and here since the hormone cannot cross the plasma membrane, but it is acting as a primary messenger because it brings the information, it is going to bind with the receptors present on the plasma membrane called as, this receptor called as extracellular receptor. Upon binding, we know that upon binding, there would be something present inside the cell which is going to act as a intracellular messenger, which could be cyclic AMP that we have discussed, or it could be calcium, that is secondary messenger. Now we are going to take an example to understand in detail the mechanism of action via membrane bound receptors. Alright, now taking an example of mechanism of action via membrane bound receptors. Now students, don't be scared just by looking at this flow chart. Okay, don't be scared. It might look big, but it is very easy. Alright, so don't get scared. It's quite easy. Just listen to me patiently. Alright. Okay, now taking the example of hormone adrenaline, you know that adrenaline, which is epinephrine, is the amino acid derivative hormone. Now since it cannot cross the plasma membrane, it is binding with the receptor. Now this receptor, students, this receptor has a specific name. This receptor is actually called as GPCR. And what do you mean by GPCR? Is G protein cell receptor. It is called as G protein cell receptor. Do you know why is it called as G protein cell receptor? Can you see some GTP, guanosine triphosphate? This receptor on its inside has alpha, beta and gamma subunits. Okay, this receptor has alpha, beta, gamma subunits. Why is it called as G protein cell receptor? Is because it has the property of binding with GTP. So you see the hormone is binding with the receptor and the GTP is available. GTP binds with the alpha subunits. Can you see? GTP is binding with the alpha subunit. GTP is soon hydrolyzed as GDP. GTP is soon hydrolyzed as GDP, and what you see that beta and gamma subunits are moving out. The beta and gamma subunit moves out, the GTP is hydrolyzed, this receptor is activated. What I have written is activation of G protein that I have shown in the plasma membrane itself. Once your G protein is activated, that is going to activate a very important enzyme, and that enzyme is adenylate cyclase. That enzyme is adenylate cyclase. Can you understand something with this name? Adenylate cyclase. The receptor will be somewhat related with the adenine. Yes, of course, upon activation of adenylate cyclase, it is going to help in the conversion of ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate, into what? CAMP. Have you heard of this name previously? I told you that there would be some secondary messengers. Since this hormone could not cross the plasma membrane, what it did inside the cell, the adenylate cyclase converted this ATP into a cyclic product, hence the name was cyclase, into cyclic adenosine monophosphate. And this conversion of ATP into cyclic AMP, this cyclic AMP is going to act as a secondary messenger. Now just see one by one what are the different reactions taking place inside the cell. Upon activation, upon forming cyclic AMP, see this cyclic AMP going to convert this inactive protein kinase A. This is going to convert this inactive protein kinase A into activated protein kinase A. This activated protein kinase A is going to cause the activation of phosphorylase kinase. This phosphorylase kinase upon activation is going to activate glycogen phosphorylase. Are you getting my point? One by one you are activating enzymes. Cyclic AMP, secondary messengers, activates protein kinase A. Protein kinase A activates phosphorylase kinase A. Phosphorylase kinase A helps in the activation of glycogen phosphorylase. And glycogen phosphorylase, as you can see, is going to cause the conversion of this glycogen into glucose 1-phosphate that ultimately gets converted into glucose. So this was not to scare all of you. This was just to tell you that how the mechanism of action of the membrane bound receptor is taking place. And why, let me tell you, this is important. Can you see I did not explain you something which is written in this blue color? And what is this? Actually, students, when you look at the mechanism of actions via nuclear receptors and mechanism of action via membrane bound receptor, there is lot of differences, but there is one more difference regarding this. This I have written is the amplification of signal. When I say amplification of signal, in the first chapter we knew that a small amount of hormone can bring a lot of changes. And that changes is way more higher in case of a membrane bound receptor. Why is it so? Is because, students, there is always a amplification. What I have written is hormone working through secondary messenger is greatly amplified. Hormones working through secondary messengers is greatly amplified, unlike the hormones working through nuclear receptors, where the response will be as much as the number of nuclear and hormone receptors complex formed. Getting my point? In case of nuclear receptors, the response will be as much as the hormone receptor complex formed. But in this case, why there is a great amplification? See, there was just one hormone. In one adrenaline, how many adenylate cyclase activated? 10. 10 activates leads to the formation of 10 is to power 2 cyclic AMP. This leads to the formation of 10 is to power 3 protein kinase A. And ultimately, can you see the glucose 10 is to power 7? So in case of the membrane bound receptors, the signals are very amplified and huge response is produced, unlike the nuclear receptors. Now students, do not be bothered about this much of the explanations, because in your NCERT you have just mentioned about the different types of secondary messengers. So this is basically to understand the mechanism of action of the membrane bound receptors or the extracellular receptors. Students, we have discussed previously that in your thyroid, if you remember, that the regulation is taking place in your body of different hormones via some feedback mechanisms. So in gist, at the end, I would like to tell you that the mechanism of hormone action takes place via feedback mechanism, which could be positive, which could be negative. right? Just like you people can give us a positive feedback if you like my teaching, if you can give me a negative feedback if you don't like my teaching. In the same way, students, hormones also can give positive or negative feedback. So this is the part that we have already discussed. Let me tell you in brief, like your hypothalamus produces the hormone TSH-RH, that is going to act upon your anterior pituitary, which releases TSH, that is going to act upon your thyroid, that releases T3 and T4. Now, how the regulation of T3 and T4 is taking place? By feedback mechanism. Suppose it is present in large amount, it is itself going to give a negative feedback to anterior pituitary so that no TSH is there, so that the level comes back to normal. In the same way, if the level is low, it is going to give a positive feedback to anterior pituitary to produce more TSH, to act more on thyroid so that the level is increased. This we have discussed already. So that means your hormones level itself can give a positive or a negative feedback. Also, I have written it over here that during the childbirth, there are vigorous uterine contractions, and we know that the oxytocin, which is also called as the birth hormone, is responsible for the uterine contractions. But do you know, when there are vigorous uterine contractions due to oxytocin, that uterine contractions further stimulates more and more oxytocin release by giving a positive feedback. That means all the hormones are going to act via the positive, not act, is going to be regulated via positive and negative feedback. In this way, we end this very beautiful chapter, and I would want all of you to please go through your NCERT, because NCERT is very important. Till then, students, we are going to be back soon. Take care, stay happy, bye-bye.